a written paper there from me, so the good stuff will be in that, if anything's any good. And I'll talk to you about a few bits of other stuff. But just to remind you that, Dylan characterised farms as purposeful, open, complex systems having to cope with substantial stochasticity. So that's where we're coming from. We're trying to draw the links between running the farm, all the external things that determine what you do and how you do it. Vic's focused on marketing, and Vic's starting point is the first marketing decision a farmer makes is the decision of what to produce. Following from that, I'm saying the how decision, one of the first, if not the first, thing you think about when you're thinking about the how, I'm saying is the gearing ratio, your balance sheet, your asset to debt ratio in your business is really, really important. And the link I'm sort of trying to make is, now I spend a lot of time building people over the head saying, for Christ's sake, don't make up your own economics, use economics, saying to scientists and non-economists, get the economics right. And I wrote that presidential paper a couple of years ago saying, where's the economics? There's so much work done around where the farm management economics seems to be missing. Now I'm on the other side and haven't done that. I'm now saying the other thing I'm saying, and I used to really criticise people who just used cash flows and finance and thought that was economics, and it's obviously not. Now I'm making this other plea, and I'm now going to get stuck into the economists or farm management economists who only think economic efficiency and economics is all you need to understand farmer behaviour and what's happening. Now our neoclassical model, it answers some really good questions. Partial equilibrium, static comparisons can answer some good questions. But what I'm now arguing is the really interesting stuff is, as well as that, is the process of getting from here to there, which brings in time and dynamics, and that brings you into actual financing and cash flows. So the economic efficiency focus is one focus. Time matters, so the sort of annual profit focus isn't really, to me, the go, isn't really what's driving farm decisions. It's more about, can I pay the bills and that will it make me richer? So I'm saying in our farm management analysis, it'd be really helpful if we did the whole package, the economic efficiency, the cash flows and the change in wealth. And that brings me down to, so you don't start with traditionally the Australians started some obsession with gross margins, a pretty meaningless concept, but it's often that's all people do. And what I'm sort of arguing is, we'll start with the balance sheet and start with the whole farm, not part of it. So there's all these, and these are all implications of being really switched on to the fact, the nature of what farming is, the nature of the game, and the nature of the environment in which you've got to work. So that said, that's sort of by way of introduction. In the paper, I found some people who've said some really good stuff about finance. And actually I titled the paper, Finance Matters. But when I read it, I realised I think the better title is Financing Matters. And you can go away and think about that for a week and see if you can think of the difference. But to me, Financing Matters is a better title for what we're trying to talk about than Finance Matters. So, but let's kick off with that great economist, that great Australian Nobel laureate economist, Les Murray. And Les wrote a poem a few years ago about, he wrote about 2003 or 4, I think, during one of the farm crises. And I'd like to read it to you. Some of us primary producers, us farmers and authors, are going around to watch them evict a banker. It'll be sad. I hate it when the toddlers and wives are sent out beside the fence crying and the big kids wear that 1,000-yard stare common in all refugees. Seeing home desecrated as you lost can do that to you. There's the ute piled high with clothes and old debentures. There's the faithful VDU shot dead, still on its lead. This fellow's dad and granddad were bankers before him. They sweated through the old hard inspections, had years of brimming foreclosure, but here it all ends. He'd lent 3/4 and only asked for a short extension. 6 months. But you have to line the drawer somewhere. You have to be kind to be cruel. It's Sydney or the cash these times. Who buys the legend of the bank anymore? The laconic teller, the salt of the earth branch accountant. It's all an own boy's story. Now they reckon he's grabbed a gun and an old coin sieve and holed up in the vault, screaming about his years of work, his identity. Queer talk from a bank Johnny. We're catching flack too from a small mob of his mates, inbred, under-manager types here to back him up. Troublemakers. Land despoiling white trash. It'll do them no good. Their turn is coming. They'll be rationalised themselves, made adapt to a multinational society. There's no room in that for the privileged traditional ways of life. No land rights for bankers. Incidentally, when I was researching Les Murray's poetry, in 1972 he wrote a collection of poems titled Poems Against Economics. And I can see a thread running through that. So that's a sort of a fundamentalist view of finance, and that's really common. You'll see that everywhere. The next interesting quote I found come from 1916, and I like this old stuff because it just sort of reinforces what we know, that in many ways not much changes. And this was, I was struck actually to find there was a book called Agricultural Economics, a US book, published in 1916, and when you go through it you realise, it makes you humble really, you realise that people knew a lot 100 years ago, and further back you might find. I'll just read what this guy said. He said, farmers are apt to denounce the great salaries paid in some walks of life, but they nearly always paid the price paid for knowledge at market rates. The farmer who prefers the life of a banker has merely to know better than anyone else what property is safest to lend on and to make this ability known. Some bank will soon want it. Farmers are large borrowers, and as they are apt to seek loans which they have not the knowledge to use wisely, the bank president must be a better judge of the possible profits of farming than the farmer himself, lest the bank's funds be invested where they cannot be got back when wanted. This means a high salary for the bank officer, which goes to reduce the profit of the farmer, for ignorance must pay its own bills. If farmers could know enough about their own business to make loans to them certain to be so wisely used as to pay interest promptly and the principal at maturity, a less expensive man could lend them money, and the farmer's profits be so much increased. So that's what I call a rationalist view of finance. So you've got all these views out there. And in the paper, and I'm not going to go through it, I'll just tell you briefly the outline. I talk a bit about financial intermediation, and I draw some pictures because I sort of think in pictures nowadays. Then I give a bit of a history of investment in agriculture because it really interests me. Don't mind interest the audience, it interests me. If you go back to Australia's economic history written of Australia, like farming's obviously always been open systems, how could it be anything but the financial flows into Australian agriculture in the long boom of 1860s to 1890s, which Butland really documented, and the impacts that had, the way that opened up, it wasn't called the long boom for no reason, right? Those financial flows. Then the Bearings Bank crashed and we had a great financial meltdown in the 1890s. The 1930s, we've had these waves of investment and disinvestment, and it's a really interesting history. And then I sort of just tracked that right up to today, where we've had MIS schemes recently discredited, and then I've got quite a lot of mates who seem to have got into this cape of putting together big pools of capital, 100 million, 200 million pools, and they're going around buying farms. And just the process of going to the Middle East and to realise that economics doesn't actually matter. We just want to buy some farms, so that we go to the Western District and we buy a heap of farms, and we actually offer 50% more than anyone's ever dreamt they'd ever sell the farm for, and we buy them. All this sort of stuff's happening, right? So this openness of our openness to international and domestic capital flows is really an interesting story in its own right. So I sort of go through the history of that. Then I had a look at our literature, and there's not much on finance and agricultural finance in the Australian ag economics literature. There's a few good bits, whereas the US literature's got a terrific tradition, and I go to a fair bit of trouble, mainly for the young people, I can say young people now, I'm getting old, to introduce them to Barry Hopkin and Baker's work, and they drew on Gail Johnson and Earl Heady. Now these are names that everyone should know, and I've been thinking lately how I can get Heady's book somehow electrified, so we can all I can get all my students and sit them down and make them bloody go through it. Because it says everything about everything to do with farm economics at great length, because it's very wordy, but it does say everything. So I document in the paper, and like how D. Gale Johnson and Chet Baker and Earl Heady introduced concepts of credit rationing, and introduced the concepts that what we nowadays would call information asymmetry. And it's the lender's perceptions of risk that actually mean the credit available is rationed. And then Heady, economists have jumped on Heady's stuff about efficiency and economies of scale. They haven't emphasised sufficiently the fact that Heady went on to say, but the real determinant of farm size is finance and gearing and borrowing capacity. You know, so that's where I'm coming from, really. I'm saying to people, let's put finance back into ag economics. So I won't go through the literature, I'll give the rest a chance, but I document, and then see Keith Campbell in the Australian literature talked about the residual funds hypothesis. He said, where do farmers get the funds to invest? And the residual funds hypothesis, he said, well, it's what's left out of income after consumption. And then a guy named Herb did a sort of rejoinder to that and basically said, well, that doesn't explain anything much, because there's a causation problem. Does the investment create the income, or the income create the investment? And then anyway, if you don't think about risk and management, you're not really going to explain much about farm investment behaviour. So I thought that was an interesting discussion, and I document that. I keep going back to Barry, Hopkin and Baker. I think they, on top of Heady and D. Gale Johnson, pretty much say everything we need to know about the role of financing and why financing matters, and the role of financing and growth, because what I emphasise is the farmers' management aim of growth, of becoming richer, building their wealth, as being a much more useful goal to focus on than annual operating profit or annual return on capital in some single year, single period thing. All that work, optimising single period farm systems, to me it's just answering questions that no one's asking. The sensible people aren't asking those sorts of questions, because it's all about what happens over time, what are the dynamics, how do I achieve my goals over this time in this game where I'm making some big bets and I don't really know much about what's going on. So I think you've got the flavour of it. I then go on to draw some implications for us trying to analyse the behaviour of farms at a much more... See, the neoclassical economic theory says, if this happens and that happens, there's a tendency for farms to behave in this way. And that's good. There's a general tendency. That'll answer a lot of questions. We're doing something else. We're actually coming down to trying to understand individual behaviour of particular farmers, why they're doing things and how they're coping with this openness that it's the nature of their game. So, and I suggest there are a couple of approaches there. Again, this is for the young people really, who are, before they get too entrenched in the old ag economics, they might start to think, oh, well, here's a way we can combine economics and finance into answering questions about growth, about liquidity, and about efficiency. So that's really what this paper's about. I don't have to go on much more. I think, we'll deal with the rest with questions, and I'll ask for questions first, and I'll hand over to Catherine. So any queries? All done? Let's move on. Catherine.